It began with something as ordinary as a broken taillight, the kind of thing police officers see 100 times a day, but that night it became the crack in a wall hiding something almost unspeakable. The highway was quiet, just the steady hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional flash of headlights cutting through the darkness. When Officer Mark Riley spotted the faded, rust-patched delivery truck ahead of him, it swerved slightly in its lane, slow enough to be suspicious, and that dim, fractured glow from the rear light was reason enough to pull it over. As he approached the driver's window, the man behind the wheel, a gaunt figure with sunken eyes and the sharp, twitchy movements of someone constantly calculating, offered an unconvincing smile. "Evening, officer," he said, voice low and tense, the kind that seemed to want the conversation over before it even began. The cab smelled faintly of gasoline, and something else, something metallic and stale. Mark kept the interaction routine at first, taking the man's license and registration, asking where he was headed so late. The driver mumbled about making a delivery and being behind schedule, his gaze darting away whenever Mark's flashlight beam strayed toward the rear of the truck. That was when it happened, a sound so faint Mark almost thought he imagined it. A soft, uneven scratching, followed by what might have been a low moan, muffled by layers of metal and darkness. His eyes narrowed, instincts kicking in. "What's in the back?" he asked, his tone now edged with authority. The driver stiffened, too slow to mask his reaction. "Just storage, old junk," he said quickly, almost too quickly, and his hand gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him steady. Mark's beam of light traced over the riveted metal of the rear door, and he saw the glint of a thick padlock, new and shiny against the truck's otherwise neglected shell. His stomach tightened. "I'm going to need to take a look," he said, moving toward the back. The driver followed, talking fast now, offering excuses, but Mark barely heard him. That scratching came again, louder this time, irregular and desperate, and with it a faint rasping sound, breathing, ragged and shallow, the kind of breathing that comes from someone who hasn't had fresh air in far too long. The padlock resisted when Mark pulled at it, the cold metal biting into his fingers. So he radioed for backup, keeping his eyes on the driver, who now stood with his arms crossed, face pale and jaw clenched. "Sir, step back," Mark ordered when the man took a step closer, voice rising in protest. Within minutes, another cruiser arrived, lights painting the night in red and blue flashes, and one of the officers brought out a heavy pair of bolt cutters. The lock snapped with a metallic crack that seemed too loud for the stillness around them. And when Mark swung the door open, the smell hit him first, stale sweat, damp cloth, and that unmistakable scent of human neglect. His flashlight beam cut into the darkness, and the shape in the far corner slowly resolved into a boy, thin, impossibly thin, knees drawn to his chest under a filthy gray blanket. His hair hung in matted clumps, shadows pooling under his wide, unblinking eyes. His ribs pressed sharply against the skin, each breath making them shift like the fragile frame of a bird. Dirt streaked his cheeks, but it was the stillness of his face, the way he didn't flinch or speak, that made the air feel heavier. "Hey, kid, it's okay. You're safe now," Mark said softly, stepping in. But the boy's only reaction was to clutch the blanket tighter and press himself further into the corner, as if the light itself was something to fear. Mark noticed the way his lips moved, almost imperceptibly, like he was whispering something to himself, a word or a name, too faint to catch. When Mark crouched down, he could see the boy's eyes darting past him to the open door, then to the driver standing outside. Between two officers, his jaw set in a cold, defiant line. The boy's gaze lingered there, and his breathing quickened, the sound breaking into small, panicked gasps. "We got to get him out now," Mark said over his shoulder, his voice tight. As another officer reached in to lift the boy, the child tensed, shaking his head almost imperceptibly, and whispered something again, the same word on repeat, his voice so hoarse it barely sounded human. Later, Mark would remember how light the boy felt in his arms, how his body seemed to fold into itself, as though he'd been shaped by the confines of the space he'd lived in. Outside, under the spinning wash of lights, the boy winced at the open sky, blinking rapidly as if the darkness had become a second skin. The driver began shouting something about misunderstandings and keeping him safe, but the words bounced uselessly into the night, drowned out by the thud of cruiser doors and the crackle of radios. Even then, Mark knew this was only the surface of something much darker. That whatever story this boy carried inside him, it had been locked away for far longer than the hours of that night. And as the truck sat there, rear door hanging open like a wound, the cool night air spilling into the space that had been his prison, the boy pressed his face into Mark's shoulder, and Mark heard, faintly but clearly, the first full sentence he'd spoken. "Please don't let him put me back." The flashing lights faded behind us as the ambulance sped away from that lonely highway, but the images were seared into my mind. The smell of stale air in that truck, the feeling of cold metal walls pressing in on me, the sound of chains rattling every time the vehicle hit a bump. For years, that was my world. I didn't know what grass felt like beneath my feet or what sunlight looked like through an open window. I didn't know there were people out there who smiled without hiding something behind it. My captor, whom I had come to call the man, never told me why I was there. He barely spoke at all, except for muttered warnings about staying quiet and not making trouble. Food came in the form of cold, canned beans or stale bread tossed into the corner, water in a cloudy jug. The truck never stayed in one place for long, sometimes parked for hours in an abandoned lot, sometimes moving for days without stopping. At night, I would lie on the thin blanket, listening to the distant hum of the road, trying to imagine another world. I only had vague memories of my parents, flashes of my mother's laugh, the warmth of my father's hand, but they felt like dreams. My real life was the walls of that truck. One night, I heard a sound that made my heart race. It wasn't the usual creak of the suspension or the hiss of brakes. It was voices, real voices. They were close. I crawled toward the door, pressing my ear to the cold metal, trying to catch every word. Then, a beam of light slashed through the darkness. My eyes burned as I squinted against it, but I didn't dare move. The door groaned open, and for the first time in years, I saw a face I didn't recognize, a man in uniform, eyes sharp but kind, holding a flashlight. My chest tightened. Was this another trick? But then his voice came, steady and sure. "You're safe now." I wanted to believe him, but my body refused to move. My mind screamed that if I stepped outside, something worse might happen. Before I could decide, his gloved hands reached for me. Not rough, but firm, lifting me into a world that felt impossibly big. The air outside was cold and alive, smelling of rain and asphalt. Lights flashed in red and blue, and strangers stared, their expressions a mix of pity and shock. The man who had kept me all these years stood a few feet away, wrists bound in steel cuffs, glaring at me with an expression I couldn't read, half anger, half something else I couldn't name. My heart pounded, and though the officer's arms felt strong, part of me wanted to run back into the truck, back to the only life I had known. But it was too late. The night had swallowed my prison, and I was in a new kind of unknown. This was just the beginning of freedom, or was something far more dangerous I didn't know yet. If you want to know what happened next, make sure you subscribe, like, and comment, because the truth that came after that night is darker than you could ever imagine. I remember my first steps outside that truck feeling unreal, like I'd been pulled out of a nightmare and dropped into another world I didn't know how to exist in. The air was cold, wet, and so sharp that it burned my lungs. My legs were weak from years of barely standing, and the ground felt unstable under my feet, as if I was learning to walk all over again. The flashing red and blue lights painted the rain-slick asphalt in surreal colors, and every sound seemed too loud. The radios crackling, the officer's boots splashing through puddles, the steady hiss of rain. I clung to the blanket around me, as if it could protect me from the stares, the questions, and the truth I wasn't ready to face. The officer walking me toward the ambulance spoke gently, but my mind kept drifting back to the sound of that truck door slamming shut all those years ago, the smell of rust, oil, and damp wood, the endless nights of darkness. Inside the ambulance, a paramedic with kind eyes checked my pulse and asked simple questions, my name, my age, but each word caught in my throat like a stone. I had a name, but it felt foreign. I had an age, but I wasn't sure if I'd truly lived those years. My eyes wandered to the open doors of the ambulance, where I caught a glimpse of the man who had kept me hidden away. He didn't look monstrous. That was the most unsettling part. He looked like anyone. Wet hair plastered to his forehead, jacket clinging to his shoulders, his hands cuffed tightly in front of him. And yet behind those dull eyes was the memory of every moment I had been hungry, cold, and afraid. The police were loading evidence from the truck into plastic bags, chains, a small battered notebook, a broken padlock. The sight of those objects made my stomach twist. They weren't just evidence. They were pieces of my life, proof of the years I'd been erased from the world. One of the officers approached and said there was someone they wanted me to meet at the station, someone who had been looking for me. My chest tightened. I didn't know if I could handle that. Not yet. But they told me it was important, that I deserved to see them. The drive to the station felt like moving between two worlds. The one I'd known, small and suffocating, and the one ahead, vast and terrifying. Every streetlight we passed made me blink against the brightness. Every passing car made me flinch at the sound of tires on wet pavement. When we finally arrived, the station smelled faintly of coffee and paper, a strangely comforting scent after so many years of diesel and rust. They led me into a quiet room, and for a moment I thought it was empty, until I saw her. She stood in the far corner, her hands trembling, her eyes wide with disbelief. My breath caught in my throat as she stepped forward, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the small room. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice breaking. I froze. The name felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who had existed before the truck, before the dark. But when she reached me, her arms wrapped around me so tightly that I thought my bones might break, I realized that for her, I had never stopped being that boy. The warmth of her embrace cut through years of cold. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't speak. I just let her hold me, my face buried in her shoulder, breathing in the scent of someone who felt like home. The officers gave us space, but I could still see the reflection of the man in the truck in the one-way glass across the room, being questioned in another. His mouth moved, his eyes darting, but all I could hear was the memory of him telling me I'd never get out. And yet here I was, holding on to the only person who had never stopped believing I would. But even as that moment wrapped around me like a fragile promise, there was something in my gut telling me it wasn't over. There were questions I didn't want answered, truths I might not be ready to hear, about why I was taken, how they had found me now, and what would happen next. Because deep down, I knew the truck was only part of the prison I'd been trapped in. The rest of it was still waiting to be uncovered. Daniel sat in that police station chair, as if it might swallow him whole. The hum of the fluorescent lights above was constant, but every so often, it would flicker, making the whole room shiver in cold pulses of shadow. His mother's hands were still clamped around his, knuckles white, as though if she let go for even a breath, he might vanish again. But Daniel's eyes were distant, locked somewhere behind the rain-streaked window of his mind, replaying the hours, the days, the years inside that truck. The station smelled faintly of wet wool and strong coffee, and the murmur of voices from down the hall was steady, broken only by the occasional metallic clang of a cell door closing. The officers had told his mother bits of the truth, careful to keep the worst of it until later, but Daniel knew that the worst couldn't be hidden. It was etched into the hollows of his cheeks, into the thin lines at the corners of his eyes that didn't belong on someone his age. An officer stepped in, a tall man with tired eyes, and knelt down to speak softly to him. His tone was gentle, but each word felt like it carried weight, questions that Daniel could not yet answer. "We're going to ask you some things about him," the officer said, sliding a photograph across the table. The captor, handcuffed and glaring into the camera like the flash had burned him. Daniel flinched at the sight, not because of the man's face, but because he could hear, in his mind, the scrape of the truck's back doors closing every night, locking him into the smell of oil, damp wood, and stale air. His mother's hand tightened again, pulling him back. But before he could say anything, another officer entered, speaking low into the ear of the first, his voice clipped with urgency. There was talk of something found in the truck, boxes, hidden compartments. They said there were chains, yes, but also papers, receipts, photographs of places Daniel had never been but might have been destined for. His mother's eyes darted between the officers, her breathing fast. Daniel's gaze dropped to the table, to the scratches in its surface, and for a moment he wasn't in the station at all. He was back inside the truck, tracing those same kinds of scratches in the metal floor with his fingernail, counting them to pass the hours. A sudden knock on the door pulled him back. A woman in a dark blazer stepped in. She wasn't a police officer, her presence too quiet, too deliberate. She introduced herself as a counselor, someone who could help him talk when he was ready. But Daniel wasn't sure he'd ever be ready. There were things inside him that felt like rusted chains, old, unbreakable, and dangerous if touched. The counselor set a bottle of water in front of him, and he stared at the condensation running down the plastic, feeling its cold seep into his fingers when he finally took it. He drank like he'd been thirsty for years, and in a way he had. The station around him buzzed with activity, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat. His captor was somewhere in this building, just walls away. He wondered if the man could hear his voice when he spoke, if he could smell the rain on Daniel's clothes and remember how it felt to keep him locked away. The thought sent a cold, crawling feeling up his spine. Outside the small, square window, the rain was slowing, the clouds thinning to a pale, watery gray, but Daniel knew the storm was far from over. As his mother squeezed his hand again, whispering that it was all over now, a part of him couldn't believe it. Because somewhere deep down, he felt that the back of that truck was still following him, that its shadow stretched longer than the years he'd lost. He glanced at the door, at the hallway beyond, and wondered if freedom would really feel like freedom, or if the bars he'd carried inside him all this time would still be there when the sun finally came out. And if you're still here, listening to Daniel's story, then make sure you subscribe, like, and comment, because what's coming next will reveal a truth that even Daniel isn't ready to face. The days after Daniel's rescue blurred into each other, a strange mix of safety and uncertainty. The police had moved him and his mother into a small safe house on the outskirts of town, a place that smelled faintly of pine and old carpet, where curtains were always drawn and an officer was stationed outside around the clock. At night, Daniel would wake to the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchenette and the faint creak of footsteps in the hallway, unsure if they belonged to a protector or a ghost from his past. He kept seeing the truck in his dreams, not just the cramped metal walls, but the way the air had felt inside, heavy and stale, every breath making his chest ache. Sometimes in the dream, he wasn't alone in the back. He'd hear shuffling, soft breathing, then the faintest tap-tap-tap against the floor. When he'd turn in the dream to look, the space behind him was empty, yet the tapping would continue until he woke up drenched in sweat. His mother tried to fill the days with normal things, cooking boxed macaroni and cheese, asking about schoolwork, putting on the television, but their conversations would trail off into silence. She knew there were questions Daniel wasn't ready to ask and answers she wasn't ready to give. One evening, a detective came by carrying a manila folder so thick it looked like it could burst. He didn't sit down right away. Instead, he stood at the counter, flipping through the pages, his face tightening with every turn. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reluctant. "Daniel," he said, "we found more." The words hung in the air like a stone sinking in water. More meant there were other children. More meant his prison hadn't been built just for him. As the detective spread photographs on the table, faded Polaroids of other kids, the same chains, the same filthy blanket, Daniel felt the room tilt. His mother's hand reached for his, but he couldn't bring himself to hold on. That night, he couldn't sleep at all. Every sound outside, the crunch of tires on gravel, the distant bark of a dog, made him tense. He sat on the couch with a blanket wrapped tightly around him, staring at the locked door, convinced the man from the truck would find a way to return. And then, just as dawn started to pale the sky, there was a knock. Not the kind of sharp, official knock police used, but slow, deliberate, each tap echoing in the small safe house. His mother stirred in the bedroom, but Daniel stayed frozen. The knocking came again, 3 times, then silence. He crept toward the door, every instinct screaming not to, but unable to stop himself. Through the peephole, he saw nothing, just the empty porch, the mist curling off the gravel driveway. He was about to turn away when, In the far corner of the porch, he saw it. A small, rusted metal box, no bigger than a lunch pail, with a strip of duct tape across the top. On the tape, in smeared black marker, were the words, "For Daniel." The morning air was colder than Daniel expected, biting at his skin even through the sweatshirt someone had given him at the safe house. The gravel crunched under his bare feet as he stepped outside, drawn by the metallic glint on the porch that had been visible through the blinds. The safe house was supposed to be secure, impenetrable. No one could just leave something there. But the small metal lunchbox sitting on the wooden step defied that promise. And for a moment, he felt as if the walls had collapsed around him again. He froze, his breath misting in the air, the sound of a distant crow cutting through the silence. Slowly, he crouched, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the rusted lid. The strip of duct tape was rough and weathered, the handwriting in thick black marker uneven but painfully familiar. For Daniel, his chest tightened, and the sound of his own heartbeat became deafening. Memories he had fought to bury clawed their way back. Nights when the truck rattled over potholes, when he counted the bolts on the ceiling just to keep from screaming, when that voice whispered promises and threats from the darkness. His vision blurred, the words on the tape swimming before his eyes. He didn't notice the door behind him creak open until his mother's voice called his name, low and tense. She was barefoot too, her hair disheveled, one hand gripping the frame as if bracing herself against a storm. "Daniel, don't touch it." But her warning came too late. His fingers had already curled around the cold metal. The sound of the latch, snapping open, seemed to echo across the empty yard. Inside, beneath a folded scrap of paper, lay something so small it almost didn't register. A single metal key, old and tarnished, dangling from a frayed red ribbon. Daniel's pulse quickened, a familiar dread creeping into his bones. His mother reached for the paper, her face draining of color as she unfolded it. There was only one sentence, scrawled in the same jagged handwriting. Asterisk, you forgot something in the dark. Asterisk, she crumpled it instinctively. But Daniel had already seen the words, already felt the cold seep into his stomach. The safe house felt suddenly exposed, every shadow deeper, every noise sharper. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a branch snapped. The detective had warned them about lingering threats, about people who don't just disappear when you escape their grip. But Daniel understood in that instant. This wasn't over. He clenched the key in his palm, its jagged edges biting into his skin, and as the wind rustled through the leaves, he swore he could hear it again. That faint, rhythmic tap-tap against the truck's metal wall, growing louder, like something. No, someone was waiting. His mother pulled him back inside, bolting the door, her hands shaking. But Daniel didn't sleep that night. He lay in the dark, the key still in his grasp, staring at the ceiling and wondering if the real prison had ever been the back of the truck, or if it had been something that followed him out into the light.